Hello, and welcome to Musing Heavy, the website devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and in this particular episode, we're going to look at part 2 of an essay I put together a little while ago called, Is It the Music or the Uniform? And here in this particular essay, one of the central questions I'm exploring, or central issues, I guess I should say, are the implications of strong adherence to the metal uniform, all right? And I'm using Metallica as sort of the case in point. So a quick little recap from some of the things I looked at in part 1. If we look at Metallica sort of through the years, right? Here's what they look like early on in their career at Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning. And you'll notice that they're sporting very strongly the metal uniform, right? And what do we mean by the metal uniform? Well, again, pretty typical that both heavy metal bands and many hard rock bands as well, and indeed the fans of these bands, were most likely to be seen wearing lots of leather, lots of black, typically, blue jeans or black jeans, running shoes, lots of long hair, of course, and almost the most important accessory would be black t-shirts displaying various heavy metal and hard rock bands, right? And again, in a lot of ways, we were walking billboards for these bands on shirts or on hats or pins or patches on the jean jackets. Again, that was pretty typical. And Metallica was sporting the metal uniform for much of their career. So certainly through Kill 'Em All to the second album, to Ride the Lightning, to Master of Puppets, again, still looking, specifically very metal. And same with the fourth album, and Justice for All, not much has changed. They're still sporting the metal outfit, the metal uniform. And at the time of the Black Album, still very much looking very metal, right? Now, this is really significant in terms of sort of the argument I'm trying to build, right? As many people know, the Black Album was Metallica's big breakthrough album, one of the biggest selling album of their career, and one of the biggest selling albums of anybody's career, frankly. However, I think I realize that, people are going to analyze this stuff in different ways, and that's totally great. But in my opinion, the Black Album represents the most significant musical shift in Metallica's amazing career, right? In other words, the style of the music on the Black Album is very different and very distinct, I would argue, from what came from And Justice for All and really all of the albums previous, right? So stylistically, in terms of music, Metallica has shifted quite profoundly for reasons that I talk about in the first YouTube presentation or the earlier part of the paper that you can check out. Or of course, there's lots of other websites you can look at that will review these albums in much more detail than I'm doing today, right? But a major shift occurred. Now, whether you like that shift or not was a different story, but there's no denying there was a big shift that occurred at the time of the Black Album, right? But as I say, significantly, though, Metallica didn't really look any different. They still looked very metal, even though their music had changed quite a bit. But by the time we get to their 6th album, and indeed their 7th album, Load and Reload, again, those two albums always put together because they really came from the same recording session, right? I would argue stylistically, the music hasn't changed that much from the Black Album. Yeah, there's change and there's a little bit of growth or progression or regression, depending on how you hear this stuff, right? But really, to me, in terms of the music, there's not a lot separating the Black Album and Load and Reload, right? The big shift musically came before the Black Album, between And Justice for All and Master of Puppets, et cetera, and the Black Album. That's your big musical shift, right? I think if there was a musical shift between the Black Album, Load and Reload, it was quite small, right? But what did shift very significantly at the time of Load was Metallica's abandonment of the metal uniform, right? I mean, they all cut their hair. And they all were styling their hair, right? They're abandoning the black t-shirts depicting different metal bands. In fact, they're wearing, in a lot of cases, they're wearing colored shirts with collars, right? They're wearing hats, all these types of things. In fact, they're dressing pretty new wavy, you might say, or alternative rock, perhaps. They sure don't look metal. Like, you wouldn't know, if you didn't know that these were the guys from Metallica, I don't think you'd pick out, oh, these are metal guys. I don't think you'd see that at all. You sure would any other time, right? You just you look at a picture of these guys on the street or wherever you might see them, and whether you knew they were members of Metallica or not, okay, metal, or at least hard rock, right? It's just understood, right? So the point I'm making is the massive backlash that occurred when Metallica released that Load album, and it was massive. And as I described, if you lived through this, I think it was unprecedented in heavy metal. No band took more heat for a release in metal that I could think of than what happened when Metallica released Load. People were just screaming mad about this album. And that always was a bit of a chin scratcher to me, because I always thought, well, okay, yeah, it's a little different, but if you really, really love the Black Album, and a lot of people appeared to really love the Black Album because it sold like crazy, but you hated Load, it was hard to square that circle if you only considered the music. So a whole lot of that hostility, I would argue, came down to the fact that Metallica changed their image, because I don't think the music changed all that much. Right. So as I say in the first part, sure, I get it. If you got off on board when the Black Album came out and said, you know what, it's too commercial, they've compromised too much, the songs are too simple for Metallica, I get that. That's about music, right? But if you love the Black Album but hated the Load album, I'm wondering if it had more to do with that you were really hung up about how Metallica looked rather than how they sounded. At least that's how it appears to me, right? And so I think that matters, right? And that's sort of what we're going to pick up on in sort of this second part of my presentation on this paper, right? So again, one could then justly deduce that it was the unmetal image Metallica was projecting that caused the most hostility, consternation around the time of Load and Reload, since the music really hadn't changed significantly post and Justice for All, right? So why is this? Why do I care about this? Why am I making a big deal about this? I think there's two important reasons why this matters, right? Number one, when appearance rivals substance, the music buyer can easily miss some great music, or perhaps end up making some ill-advised purchases, right? I'm going to give you some actual examples of what happened to me when I was a young metalhead on that. And two, and perhaps I would argue even more importantly, an overreaction to appearance by the fan base may influence bands to respond in ways that ultimately stifle artistic exploration, right? And when that happens, we all actually end up losing. And I think that's actually what's happened to Metallica when we consider the last couple albums, which I'm going to get to sort of bring this all together, right? Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit. Would you buy an album from Sailor James? Okay, what am I talking about here? Okay, we'll get to that. So although in more cult form earlier, perhaps, say in the 60s and 70s, the heavy metal uniform became a universally understood symbol of dress by the 1980s. So as I was discussing earlier, it didn't really matter if you were a metal fan or not. You understood that if you saw somebody on the street wearing a leather jacket, jeans, a Slayer t-shirt, and if you were a guy had pretty long hair, you didn't have to know the person at all. You say, okay, that guy's into metal. That's a metal guy, right? And not that every heavy metal fan wore the uniform all the time, or some didn't wear it at all, really. It still was understood that if somebody looked that way, they were a metal or a hard rock fan, right? Now, of course, the metal uniform, if you like, all of this predates, when we're talking this 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s to a large degree, this predates the internet and extensive printed material on heavy metal, especially in the 70s and 80s then, right? So how did we find new albums from new bands we didn't know about, right? Well, most fans bought records either based on word of mouth and or by the appearance of record jackets, right? So how did I find out about new bands? Well, it was my friends told me about them and I checked them out, or just by hanging around my local record store, right? And talking to the vendors there, and they would sort of turn me on to new bands, et cetera. So that's I beefed up my record collection doing that sort of stuff, as many hard rock and metal people did back in the day. So I certainly wasn't unique there, I'm sure, right? Or I know a lot of people, including myself, bought a lot of albums based on the appearance of the record jackets, right? Although this might seem kind of trite to the younger metal fan of today, right? But many of our purchases were made on the strength of how heavy or how metal the front and or back sleeves appeared, right? Again, it didn't matter, a new Judas Priest album, a new Black Sabbath album, a new Iron Maiden album. No, didn't matter. We already knew those bands were great. They were heavy. We just bought them, right? There was no big guesswork there, right? I'm talking about new bands that you didn't know, right? Well, how did what made you make that decision to buy their product, right? So in particular, it was albums depicting bands in the uniform. Bands where the guys were wearing the metal uniform had a much better chance of being added to our collections. But of course, this approach was always imperfect, and it actually still is, right? For instance, many mediocre albums populated metal fans' collections when the music did match the promise of the uniform being depicted, right? So the album might look really metal, but when you took it home and played it, well, maybe it was great, maybe it wasn't, right? And worse still, how many excellent albums were ignored or not given enough of a chance if the band was not displayed in their best metal light? I'm going to give you a couple examples of that actually, that I can attest to that happened to me personally. And these are just two of many, many examples, right? As a young metalhead and as an older metalhead, I'm still buying, albums like crazy. I'm an old school guy. I still like the product. I don't download stuff. I don't stream. I like to buy. I used to buy albums. Now I buy CDs, right? And I'm still that way. Anyway, so back in the day, so when we talk about, say, the 80s, late 70s, like I say, there was no internet where I could check to say, oh, okay, is this a good album? Should I check it out? What's it like? What's the style? Would I like it? Get reviews. You couldn't do that sort of stuff, right? So a lot of times, unless I was getting some word of mouth advice, I had to just, I'm flicking through the bins at Records on Wheels or Sam the Record Man or wherever I was, all kinds of record stores I used to hang out in all the time. And I'm going through the bins and say, this looks metal, right? So here's a couple quick examples, a couple of like hundreds, maybe thousands of examples of how I purchased this stuff. Guitar Pete's Axe Attack, Dead Soldier's Revenge. Okay, I didn't know this album. I didn't know one note of this album. I had no idea about this band. I don't know who this Guitar Pete is, right? But boom, the album's up in the bins. This looks promising. Why? Well, first of all, the album cover. I mean, that looks pretty darn metal, even before we even look at what any of the players might look like, right? Guitar Pete's Axe Attack in very fiery letters, for one thing, right? Well, axe being, of course, slang for, heavy guitar. So, okay, yeah, promising. A pretty gory front cover for the day, actually quite gory nowadays. I mean, it's nothing, but back then, okay, that's catching my eye. Dead Soldier's Revenge. Well, that sounds pretty darn metal as well. So you flip over the album cover, and what do we get? Wow, there's Guitar Pete in all his glory, right? All right, his hair is pretty long, but look, he's all in black, lots of leather going on. The tassels on the leather jacket, Ozzy kind of made that famous, I guess. Bullet belt. Now, there's a real metal accessory if you're ever going to see one, right? Oh, and of course he's posing on a bike, which again, often very heavy metal there. And if you look at some of the song titles, it doesn't come out too well, but Satan's Twister, Ball Breaker on. Okay, this is really metal. And another little capper. I actually remember reading this because you examine these things pretty closely to decide if you want to buy it or not, right? Special thanks to Richie Blackmore, the first person he thanks. Well, of course, I'm a huge Richie Blackmore fan. I have been since I was like an embryo, basically, right? And it's like, oh, Richie Blackmore? This guy knows Richie Blackmore? Okay, can't miss, right? Boom. Give me the album here. How much money you want, Ben? Take all my money. I don't care. I need Guitar Pete. It's that simple, right? So I take it home and listen to it. Yeah. I mean, it's okay. I don't hate the album. I still think it's pretty cool, actually. But I mean, again, it kind of delivers, it kind of doesn't, right? So like I say, that approach, although we didn't have a lot of choice, right? We were looking for the metal uniform, and the more metal or the more heavy it appeared, we just sort of made the trend. Okay, the music's got to be great. Well, sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. Another example, very similar, Battle Axe. I didn't know Battle Axe, right? But I was a real sucker for anything of the new wave of British heavy metal. It's still one of my all-time favorite eras of rock. I used to collect everything I could from the new wave of British heavy metal. So, of course, these are actually also import albums at the time. So these things weren't cheap, right? Anyway, I didn't know Battle Axe, but, I'm limping through. Battle Axe. Well, that's a pretty heavy metal name. Okay, that's very promising. Power from the Universe. Okay, very, very tough, very metal title for the album. I think, okay, this is looking good. And then, of course, front cover, back cover, the band is totally decked out in the metal uniform. Well, okay, that's a no-brainer. I need to have Battle Axe. And you know what? Take it home, listen to it. Yeah, it's okay, right? Actually, Battle Axe, then this was their second album. Then I bought their first album called Burn This Town. Probably a little better, right? Not a terrible band. They're okay. And like I say, I got a soft spot for new wave of British heavy metal. I try to be a completist with that era. But for somebody else, just a more casual metal fan, or even maybe a hardcore metal fan, who isn't as obsessed with that era of heavy metal, they'd listen to this, go, it's non-essential, right? And I guess that's how I'd hear this. It's okay, right? But did it warrant, spending big import dollars? Probably not, right? But again, it sure looked metal, so bang, I'm in there, right? Okay, didn't work every time. Sometimes it did. Like sometimes you found some real gems. Sometimes, so is it imperfect? But maybe more of a problem was that I would pass over some absolute gems because they didn't look metal at the time. So here we are again, 1982. Again, I have corrected this massive error in subsequent years, because this album by Discharge called Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing, right? I've passed on that album. I can't say that I actually saw it in the stores when it first came out. Doesn't really matter. I can guarantee as a young metalhead, I wouldn't have bought it, right? You look at the album cover, okay, there's nothing that screams metal to me there. It looks kind of artsy. Maybe it's a new wave band. I don't know. Flip over the cover. Oh, it's a punk band. Oh, sorry. I'm a metal guy. I'm not listening to no punk or hardcore, right? So I would just ignore that, right? Like I say, I've been listening to Discharge now for, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years, but it took me a while. But I'll tell you, the irony of it is these guys were heavier, more aggressive, in a lot of ways more metal than these two, like by a long shot, right? But they didn't look particularly metal. They weren't wearing the uniform, so pass. And maybe the biggest mistake I ever made was passing for many years. It took me decades to get around to listening to Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols, right? Now, of course, the Pistols were so notorious when they first started. Of course, I knew about them, but I wasn't going anywhere near a punk band. And then I look at their album and go, well, what the heck is this? This can't be heavy or anything heavy. It's pink, for crying out loud. And it's got this, this lime green going on and these weird just song titles on the back. And don't need that. Well, of course, huge mistake, because as far as hard rock, and I would say Nevermind the Bollocks is basically a metal album. I mean, I don't care how spiky their hair are. I mean, this is a metal album and one of the greatest hard rock / metal albums ever recorded. So again, of course, I fixed that error, but many years later, right? So you kind of get the point, right? So the approach of buying or getting into bands based on how they look was an imperfect science at the best, right? And lots of times it didn't work out the way you hoped it would. Sometimes you got lucky and it worked, right? But lots of times you populated your record collection with a lot of mediocre releases that were probably you didn't really need, and then you missed out on a ton of great stuff if you were worried too much about appearance, right? Okay, I have no doubt though that the younger heavy metal enthusiasts of today, while having the advantage of being able to listen to songs before purchasing, and also, of course, being able to read reviews, etc. So in a lot of ways, you got it much easier than I did back in the day, right? But even though you have the internet, well, we all have the internet. It's like I don't have the internet, but we all have the internet, right? And we can read reviews and we can listen to things. You can stream stuff, you're not even purchasing anymore. So that part's great, right? But I also suspect that metal fans of today are just much more open-minded, right? And this would be congruent with the more tolerant reputations of generations Y, Generation Z, and traits perhaps emerging amongst the alpha class as well, right? Many within these cohorts expect and or rely on fewer stereotypical trappings for points of reference. And you know what? If that's the case with you, if you're a younger metalhead or just a younger person in general, I mean, good for you. Because stereotyping usually gets us in trouble in one way, shape, or form, right? So has the importance of the metal uniform sort of declined a little bit with time? Perhaps, but I think there's a limit to this too, right? So while a lot of newer metal bands still look the part in a traditional sense, and they do. I mean, I think of newer metal bands, a lot of them still wear the uniform. I mean, it's still out there in a big way, and lots of fans still wear the metal uniform too, right? I mean, just look at t-shirt sales, that alone, there's just, lots of people still wearing the black t-shirts, walking around with their Megadeth shirts on, right? So these aren't new things, right? But then again, there's other bands, metal bands that have adopted an anti-fashion presentation and are much more nondescript in their appearance too. So we're getting all types, right? But even today, right? Even if the metal uniform's importance has diminished a little bit in some ways, I am convinced that only so much deviation would be tolerated without consequences. Okay, so let's be really goofy here for a second and consider a scenario where James Hetfield, I mean, of course, the awesome vocalist and rhythm guitarist for Metallica, let's say James, for whatever reason, started donning the whites of a sailor suit. So again, I'm sure James would never do this. I'm not trying to make fun of James. I think, as you can tell from these essays, I'm a huge Metallica fan. James is like a hero of mine, so I'm not making fun of James. Let's just pretend, right? Just to sort of make a point here. Let's say suddenly James is coming on stage and maybe taking pictures of himself in albums in a sailor suit, so decked right out, all in white, the nice little cap, looking like Popeye, the whole thing, okay? And he wasn't joking around, all right? It wasn't Halloween or anything. He was serious. He just thought, I think I look cool as a sailor, so here I go, right? Okay, just pretend he did that, right? Okay, so that's about as far away from the metal uniform as I can think of, right? If you dress up like a sailor, I suppose, right? Well, don't tell me, even by today's standards, that there wouldn't be massive backlash from the Metallica fan base if he went ahead and did that, right? I think it's safe to assume that this would not enhance Metallica's fortunes in any way. In fact, it would be just the opposite, right? You could count on massive backlash that could even affect them, I think, commercially, quite substantial, could affect their album, concert sales, all that stuff, right? But here's the kicker in this stupid little scenario. I think it actually would be better if we did accept, or at least not care, about Sailor James or any fashion choice from any band, right? Because I just believe the music would be better if we did. So if there was no such thing as a metal uniform, and especially if we didn't care much about it, and if Sailor James wanted to look like Sailor James, you go, oh, ain't that nice? James is a sailor today, whatever, which I know wouldn't happen. I know there'd be massive backlash, but I still think we'd be better off if that's the attitude we took, right? So while I think the importance of the metal uniform has subsided, as time goes on, I think it only goes so far. I think it's still there, and I think it's still really important to a lot of people. Okay, so moving forward, and here's where I think when we put too much emphasis on appearance, then it does have a direct relationship to the quality, or at least the type of music we're going to be listening to. So here's where I start to bring it maybe full circle here. Okay. So Metallica finally wises up, or did they give in, right? So I'm going to continue on. So, you might notice in this paper so far, I've only really talked about, we've gotten as far as load and reload, right? Well, I'm going to finish this story by considering Metallica's last 3 studio albums and how this is fitting in with their image as well, and how it's actually affecting the music. Okay. So just like the fans, or perhaps because of the fans, bands often link appearance or image with their musical output. For many, it's still all part of the package. Like I say, I don't think you can ever, in terms of heavy metal and hard rock, looking metal, I don't think will ever really go away. The reason for any criticism or drop in sales, right, say for a particular album, then might not be easily understood by a band. In other words, was it really a bad album, or was it a bad haircut? Why aren't we selling as much as we used to, for instance, right? So when that happens, a remedy might be to return to the things that brought approval commercially or critically, in terms of the image or the music, right? So you return to what was working before if things aren't going so well, right? Okay, so the fan base might say, hey, that's great. Return to when you were Master of Puppets. I'm all in on that, right? But bands that start to play to their audience's expectations, I think inevitably start to lose their creative edge, right? Now, how many times have you heard artists at their peak of ingenuity, when they're actually at the absolute peak of their careers, right? And every band sort of has their peaks, right? But how many times have you heard say something to the effect that, you know what, we make music for ourselves, right? Ultimately, we got to follow our muse. If other people like it, great, and we're hoping other people like it. But really, we make music for how we hear it, right? So the fact that bands want other people to like their music is important, but not the overriding reason, right? But when it becomes the overriding reason, then we start to get in trouble. And then I think we're sort of embarking on the sellout sort of phase that some bands go through. Now, what do we mean by selling out? Most people associate selling out, especially in heavy metal, and it's usually negative, right? When people talk about selling out, meaning that you change your musical direction to try to move more units. And in heavy metal, that almost inevitably means that you soften up, you become more melodic, your songs usually become, they're not as long, they're produced in a certain way that sort of resembles pop music or hard rock music, etc., right? Okay, that would be one form of selling out. But I think another form of selling out is overtly seeking the approval of your most loyal hardcore following. So another form of selling out is to just replicate what the hardcore music fan wants you to do, right? So a lot of people don't consider that selling out, but I think it is another form of selling out. So you can sell out to try to be more commercially appealing, say, to a pop audience. That's one form. Or you can sell out to appease the hardcore of your fan base. Now, again, there's a lot of hardcore fans that say, well, that's what you should do. I'm your real fan, so you should make music just for me. I think that's a problem because, again, if you go back to the premise that the best music we're going to get out of any artist is when they make music for them first, the artist, right? And then if other people like it, great. When they start making music for a specific fan base, whether it be trying to run after the pop market or they're hardcore, they're still kind of selling out, right? Or that's what I think. So when you're trying to just appease your hardcore fan base, you might say that's admirable, and it is in some respects, I guess, right? But this is still a compromise, okay? And it can be just as damaging as the band that sells out to try to, to try to become Def Leppard or something, right? Okay, I think this is what's happened with Metallica. I'm sad to say, but I do believe Metallica has sort of sold out. And I don't think the sellout was with Load, my friends, as a lot of, or even the Black Album. I think the sellout's actually happening now. All right. Okay. So I think this happened with Metallica, but there was a one album lag before the true concessions kicked in. Saint Anger, all right, so now we're kind of moving into the last few albums of Metallica's career, which was released in 2003, represents Metallica's second most profound musical shift. And I would argue was really the last time the band, for better or worse, was truly progressing. Okay. Now, Saint Anger has some controversy associated with it too, which always happens when a band is continuing to progress, usually, right? The drum sound is very questionable, right? And perhaps most controversial is there's almost a complete lack of guitar solos. I mean, I'm sure people before it got released thought this would be unthinkable. You got Kirk Hammett, one of the greatest lead guitarists in all of metal, I think pretty much hands down, right? One of the top for sure. And there's a 70-minute album and he has no guitar solos. I mean, you thought this is just weird. Like, how is this happening, right? But having said that, aside from those controversies, questionable production and like sort of where's Kirk on the lead sort of thing, right? This is the closest Metallica came to very aggressive, thrashy music in many years, right? Really, what Saint Anger is, it's sort of a meshing of sort of thrash metal and nu metal, right? It's a fairly unique album. At the time, there was nobody who was really sounding like this, right? This mixing of musical styles was quite fresh, and at the time, and arguably very innovative, I would argue, right? Now, again, whether you liked it or not was a different matter, but Metallica was still being really, really innovative as they'd always been, at least up until that point. But where the band starts to rehash at the time of Saint Anger is in their appearance. They bring back the metal uniform. So let's kind of jump back into our fancy pictures of Metallica. So again, we've looked at these. So looking metal all the way up to and including the Black Album, looking anything but metal during Load and Reload, right? And here we are at Saint Anger. Guess what? The metal uniform's back, everybody. Yes, don't forget, at the end of the day, Metallica is a metal band, and here they are. So what's happening? Okay, well, first of all, they're all in black again. And then lots of kind of metal pictures, right? The hair's coming back. Kirk is growing his hair out. You got Rob Trujillo, the new bassist at this point. Rob's always looked really metal, so there he is, right? Big hulking, awesome bass player. I mean, they're always great players. All of Metallica can play like a house on fire, always, right? But here, the metal uniform is totally back. And just so I don't jump back and forth all the time, Death Magnetic, 100% metal uniform back. Look at all that black. Look at all that leather. Lots of hair going on. You know, the black shades. That's another kind of typical accessory of heavy metal, etc. And then the last album, Hardwired to Self-Destruct. There they are looking, again, very metal, I would argue. Lots of black all over the place. Total black, really. Right? And again, looking metal. Okay. So around the time of Saint Anger, so musically, the band's still progressing. They're actually more aggressive now than they've been in quite a few years, but a different kind of sound. Again, whether you like it or not is another thing, right? But where they're rehashing at this point is an image. Now Metallica is back looking very metal, which they hadn't for quite a few years, right? So the images used throughout Saint Anger's album sleeves are angry and aggressive. The lads are showing wearing largely basic black with notable hair growth, or at least not so deliberately styled. I mean, maybe, you can only do so much. If you're losing your hair, well, you can't grow it, but you don't have to deliberately style it either, which would be more metal, right? And you can see that that's going on. Or you wear a metal cap like Lars is doing, that sort of thing. And the new bass player, Robert Trujillo, looks very metal. In short, the uniform has made a distinguished return, right? Metallica, and now, so they're rehashing at this point. The music's still progressing at Saint Anger, but the image has come back in terms of the metal uniform. Metallica is no mistaking. Metallica is a metal band if you look at them at this point. Whereas around Load, who knows what they are, right? Okay. Now Metallica comes all the way back to their origins in fashion and music by the time we get to Death Magnetic, 2008. And the Allied mini album, Beyond Magnetic, which came a couple years later, but again, it's all from the same session. And then also with Hardwired to Self-Destruct. So now Metallica is rehashing not only the image, the metal image, they're also rehashing the style of music, which I'll get to a little bit in a second. Quick disclaimer, I'm not even going to talk about Lulu here because first and foremost, I don't consider Lulu a Metallica album. To me, it's a Lou Reed album. So that's a collaboration between Metallica and Lou Reed. It's a Lou Reed album. So I don't even hear it as a Metallica album. I hear it as a masterpiece, mind you. It's not a Metallica album. If you want more of my reaction to Lulu, and again, as I do with all my things, they're not just reactions to albums, they're framed within topics. Check out my essay and YouTube presentations on the importance of labeling in hard rock and heavy metal, the case of Lulu. There I talk about, I think, why Lulu was so misunderstood is because it wasn't labeled properly. So you can check that out if you're interested. So getting back to Death Magnetic. Death Magnetic was much more than a casual nod to the past. Again, here I'm talking musically. We know they're looking metal at this point, so they've completely come back home there. But musically, they've totally come back home, some might say. Its white album jacket, production approach, complex song structures, and clothing choices strongly associate this work with Injustice for All, right? And I would say even albums earlier. Death Magnetic, I would argue, might be the band at their peak of performance. The guitar work on that album is astounding. The riffs, the solos are just amazing. Lars is drumming incredibly well on the album. He seems more concerned again with technical stuff than being in the groove. And Rob is just an awesome bass player. Incredibly good stuff. I love the album, as I do Hardwired to Self-Destruct, but I will also say this. There is not one new thing on Death Magnetic. As much as I love the album, and I do, there's nothing new. When you listen to that album, you can place almost every, I'm not saying they're copying themselves, but the style of music it's stuff that Metallica did for years before Load, Reload, and the Black Album, essentially, right? So as great as that album is, it's completely retro, which again, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing because I sure enjoy listening to it, but Metallica is no longer an innovative band at this point, right? Which is a loss because they were perhaps the most innovative band in metal for many years, right? So again, Death Magnetic is a retread, so much so that many reviewers really for the first time criticized the band for repetition. Of all the bad reviews Metallica got around Load, Reload, even the Black Album by some people, right? Nobody accused them of being repetitious. Now that's the big criticism, if there is any. And the new material contained within the Hardwire package did not maybe retread quite as much. I'm hearing a little bit of a musical progression with Hardwired. It's a lot of songs on there. It's basically a double disc or double, I don't know how many vinyl albums it is, right? It's a lot of material, right? I still hear it mostly as a retread, but there might be a little more growth there. However, by including live material, so if you got the bonus stuff with Hardwired, right? There's a whole bunch of covers and stuff. And then there's a lot of cool live material. Well, what's interesting to me on that whole package, it's a bonus CD or it would be bonus downloads or however you're consuming this stuff. But the live stuff that's included with the Hardwired package is, with the exception of 2 songs, it's all from the first 2 albums. It's songs all from Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning, right? Other than Helpless and the title track, Hardwired, it's all, so it's a total blast from the past, like completely, right? So by comprising live material almost exclusively of songs from the first 2 albums, it was assured that the audience would unmistakably connect the band with their storied, thrashy past, right? So at least since Load, much of Metallica's prime fan base has been pining for a return to the heavy metal, thrashy heavy metal Metallica. And basically, that's what you got. That's what Death Magnetic and that's what Hardwire gave you. It's a complete return, basically, to Metallica's first 4 albums, right? So you got what a lot of people have been screaming for, but we pay a price for this, my friends. It's not free. As good as those albums are, and I do like them, but they are missing something really, really important, and that's Metallica as a forward-thinking, innovative force. Those days appear to be over. Right? So what did we win? Okay, as I've been saying, I continue to enjoy both Magnetics, the album and the mini thing, and Hardwired. I think there's great songs, fine performances, and just lots of great stuff to listen to. Regrettably, it's also likely that Metallica's innovative, forward-thinking days are past us. And that's a big loss, right? So why did this happen? Why is Metallica no longer this innovative, progressive force they once were? Was this the natural consequence of a decaying creative cycle? That's possible, right? I mean, every band can only be innovative for so long before they start to retread. And that happens to the best of them. So to expect Metallica to be this creative force forever is maybe unrealistic. So that's possible. So it could be a bit of that. Or was it a sellout? And sellout, the way I was describing it before, a sellout to the hardcore component of their fan base. I suspect it's more the latter. I mean, I don't know. I'm not in Lars and James's head, right? But everything that when I'm listening to things and everything I've read, my suspicion seems to be it's that they've kind of sold out to their fan base. I think Metallica has become gun shy of any form of significant stylistic change, whether it be image or music, and are loath to incur the wrath of their crowd yet again, right? I think they took just way too much backlash, a little bit for the Black Album, but Load and Reload was just, right? And they took a lot of heat for Saint Anger too. I think they finally said, fine, let's give the people what they want. The people being their hardcore base, right? So here's the thing. If Metallica's creative nucleus, again, largely James and Lars, because they do the lion's share of the writing for the band, if James and Lars truly did have something more to say beyond just repackaging, reiterating, and retreading, because I think that's what, as good as those two albums are, the newest ones, that's what they're doing. There's very little, if anything, new there, right? So if they really did have something new to say, right, but were finally worn down by those who could not accept their change or progress, we lose, all right? Sure, we get more of what we essentially already have, right? Admittedly, in a slightly different form, performed by an exceptional band. I'll give you that. There's still great albums, and it's always great to hear Metallica play, right? However, is it better to support artists who might occasionally release something we don't like in exchange for pushing the boundaries of metal or music in general? All right, I'll just leave that as a question. I know where I stand, but maybe that's something people can think about, right? But look at it this way. If Metallica had not been so unique and so innovative in the early days, we never would have gotten Kill 'Em All or Ride the Lightning, right? And if they chose to look more like their popular contemporaries, they might have ended up being just another hair metal band from Southern California. So maybe Metallica, again, if it was more about just fitting in and not being unique and pushing the boundaries, maybe they end up being another Motley Crue. I mean, I don't hate Motley Crue, but Metallica, come on, they're not even the same field as far as I'm concerned, right? So wouldn't that have been a shame? So the fact that Metallica was always being innovative, pushing forward, that's what made them great, right? I think that's gone, right? So to bring this full circle, if negative reaction to Load and Reload based largely on the abandonment of the metal uniform was not so intense, would Metallica be a more inventive and progressive unit today that could be more convincingly justifying their present position atop the metal mountain, right? Or in a more general sense, would we get superior music if fashion was largely irrelevant or at least not taken very seriously? I say yes to both questions, right? What do you say? Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.